All right, as we close out the 1970s, we're going to do a quick run through of the politics that happened after Richard Nixon. So we're only going to look at two presidents today, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter, and we're just going to kind of hit the high points of their presidencies. So we'll start with Gerald Ford. Of course, he takes over after Richard Nixon resigned. He was actually the first president that was never elected president or vice president. If you remember, Richard Nixon, his original vice president was a guy named Spiro Agnew, and Agnew had to resign because he had his own legal troubles, and Nixon chose to replace him with Gerald Ford. This was part of the 25th Amendment, that in the event of a vacancy in the vice presidency, a new one could be appointed. He had to be confirmed by the Senate, but then he became the vice president. Then when Nixon resigned, he, of course, became the new president. Now, Gerald Ford has lots and lots of challenges to his ability to get reelected. Let's think of what politics is. It's all about getting reelected. He's got a problem because, number one, he's associated with Nixon. Doesn't matter that he is a good guy. Doesn't matter that he didn't do anything. He was still Nixon's vice president, so that's automatically going against him. But then Gerald Ford is going to cause himself some problems when one of the first things he does is he gives Richard Nixon a pardon. In Ford's mind, this was a good idea because it would save the country the embarrassment of having to put the former president on trial. His idea was just, look, let's move on. Let's get beyond this. But of course it didn't make us happy. He then turns around and he offers a limited amnesty to people who dodged the draft during the Vietnam War. Again, the idea of we're going to move on from this. We've basically finished with Vietnam. Let's put this behind us. Again, it makes people angry. Because on the one hand, you have people who said, wait, I put my life on hold and I went, and these people didn't, and they're getting away with it. You have people who look at them as criminals because, they were supposed to go. And then even some of the amnesty didn't apply to everyone. And so even some of those people were like, well, hold on, wait a minute. How come they get off and I don't? Ford also has the challenge of Congress is going to reassert its authority over the federal government and what the federal government does. Part of this is a reaction to Nixon and his abuse of the presidency, something we call now the imperial presidency. The idea that the president is kind of acts all-powerful when in reality he shouldn't. So Congress is going to go through and they're going to try to reassert their authority and also take authority back from the presidency. And so through their investigations, they are going to discover that since the 1950s, the CIA had taken an active role in assassinating leaders of foreign countries who were anti-United States or maybe pro-Soviet Union. They had helped to stage coups in other countries to overthrow democratically elected governments in some cases. They also will investigate the FBI and discover that the FBI has also been abusing its authority and had been initiating wiretaps on American citizens without cause and without warrant in some cases. And so all of this stuff comes out while Ford is president. It all just kind of has a snowball effect to kind of make his administration unpopular. In terms of foreign affairs, in May of 1975, what is sometimes called the last Battle of Vietnam happens. There's this thing called the May-Giz incident. I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly at all. But what it was a U.S. merchant ship that was sailing off the coast of Cambodia, and it was captured by a group that had taken over the Cambodian government called the Khmer Rouge. The military launched a rescue operation, and the military was acting on bad intelligence. They believed that the crew was being held on one island. They were not. In the resulting firefight, 15 American soldiers were killed, and so the rescue operation just went horribly wrong. There's also a group in the world called the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. If you don't know who they are, you need to. These are the countries that essentially have all the oil in the world, all the what we call the sweet light crude oil. It's easy to refine. This is not all the countries that have it, but this is a lot of them, including Saudi Arabia. Well, in the 1970s, they sought to increase the price of oil. And one of the ways they did that, this may not have been to increase the price of oil by itself, but they launched an embargo of the United States in 1973 as the United States continued to support Israel, especially during the Yom Kippur War of 1973. Most of the OPEC nations are Muslim countries in the Middle East who don't like Israel. And so in 1973, they refused to sell oil to the United States. This would force oil prices up, and this is going to cause economic problems. So some of those economic problems. The big one is this thing called stagflation. Stagflation was an economic problem that we came up with a term for it in the 70s. It involves two things happening at the same time. Number one, inflation, which you should know. Inflation is where prices are going up. The dollar is losing its purchasing power. It is losing value. Your dollar can no longer buy as much as it used to. And so you have to put in more dollars to buy the same amount. You had inflation, and you also had unemployment going up. And of course, we know what unemployment is when people don't have jobs. Here's the thing. All basics of economics say that these two things cannot happen at the same time. Inflation occurs in part because people are spending money. And if people are losing their jobs, they are not spending money, and therefore producers have to cut prices in order to sell their product. And so inflation and unemployment should not occur at the same time. And the problem with stagflation is nobody really knew how to fix it. Okay? Part of the reason we had stagflation was the oil embargo, because the price of oil went up, which meant the price of shipping went up. And because the price of shipping went up, producers had to keep their prices high in order to recover all that. So part of this comes from the OPEC oil embargo. I apologize for the typo there. Now Ford, like I said, nobody really had a solution for this, because anything you do to lower inflation tends to cause unemployment. And anything you do to lower unemployment tends to cause inflation. And so both of these things are bad, and they're getting worse. And so Ford's solution was to come up with a program that he called Whip Inflation Now, with the acronym WIN. And what that was, it was going to be voluntary agreements by businesses to not raise their prices, that they would keep the prices to a manageable level to help control inflation. The problem is, if the business's costs go up, they have to raise prices. And so Ford's WIN program was a failure. Didn't get a whole lot of traction to it. Now, all that considered, in 1976, you would think that Ford is going to go down into disastrous defeat. The thing that ultimately hurt him was the economy, but there's some important things going on in 1976. First of all, the Republicans are kind of divided. You have the moderate Republicans who are going to support Gerald Ford and say, this guy deserves another term, let's give him a chance to fix it. The other group of Republicans are called conservatives. We'll talk more about conservatives and moderates and liberals later. But conservatives supported Ronald Reagan, former governor of California. So conservatives generally want government out of involvement in day-to-day lives. And so the Republicans were kind of split. Now, ultimately, they did nominate Ford, and ultimately, most of the conservative Republicans turn and do support President Ford for re-election. The Democrats are going to nominate this guy, Jimmy Carter, governor of Georgia. He's going to campaign as an outsider. What this meant was that he was not part of Washington, D.C., and so he attaches the idea of corruption and corrupt politics to people serving in Washington, D.C. for too long. And he says, I am an outsider. I am better. I am not corrupt like all those people in Washington. Like we've seen with Richard Nixon, like we've seen with other scandals in Congress and whatnot. And he's going to end up being elected. Now, it was actually a very close election, at least in terms of popular vote. Not quite as close in the electoral vote, but you should know that the electoral vote distorts it a little bit. But Carter now gets elected, and one of the problems Carter has is he has to deal with Congress. Now, Carter is a Democrat. And Congress, both houses of Congress, were controlled by Democrats after the 1976 elections. And yet, they are going to fight Carter and his plans and his policies and his programs. Part of it is because Congress is continuing to try to expand its authority. This is still a reaction to the Nixon presidency. And so you saw the investigations, whatever, during Ford's administration. You continue to see that during Carter's administration as Congress continued to place restrictions on the president and on the office of the presidency. He also has a problem with experienced Democrats in Congress. Now, Carter's a Democrat. These are experienced Democrats. But he campaigned as an outsider, essentially saying everyone in Congress is corrupt. These are now the people he has to work with. And so because he campaigned against them, they're basically going to try to kind of put him in his place, so to speak. You don't tell us what to do, we tell you what to do, maybe. He also has to deal with younger Democrats who have come in over the last couple of years who they are fighting against the imperial presidency, and they want to prove to the voters back home that they're independent of what the president tells them to do. That he doesn't tell them what to do. They make their own decisions. And so they're trying to prove their independence by not doing whatever it is he wants. And so he's got to deal with all that. Plus, in addition, he's got to deal with the Republicans. They're going to vote against him simply because they're Republicans, and he's a Democrat. So when it comes to the domestic programs of Carter's administration, we really don't kind of think a whole lot about them. He does get Congress to create something called the Department of Energy. This was a response to the oil and energy crisis of the 70s. He also got Congress to approve the creation of the Department of Education, where the national government is going to take a more active role in the nation's public school education in terms of curriculum and funding for schools and direction for schools and what they need to teach and how they need to teach it. There were environmental issues and legislation that was passed while Carter's president. One of the big issues, there was a nuclear accident at a nuclear power plant called 3 Mile Island, which is in Pennsylvania. There was a threat of a nuclear meltdown. It did not melt down, but there was a release of radiation into the atmosphere and into the water surrounding the plant. And so it really made people in the United States start to think seriously about the benefits and the costs of nuclear energy and the dangers associated with it. The Environmental Protection Agency also created something called the Superfund. Because of the environmental movement that existed through the 70s, the government started taking a more active role in trying to help clean up areas of the country that had become toxic. And so the EPA created the Superfund. Businesses pay into it when they are guilty of breaking environmental regulations or whatever, and then that money is turned around and is used, hopefully, to clean up some of these areas. Now, Carter's biggest problem domestically is the economy, because Gerald Ford couldn't fix stagflation. Well, Jimmy Carter couldn't either, and so stagflation continued, and so you saw prices increasing, and unemployment still not coming down through the late 70s. Now, what we think of when we think of Carter and his presidency mostly are going to be the foreign affairs that happen in the late 70s. In Latin America, Carter was more interested in promoting human rights, and this is a good thing. And so throughout the Cold War up to this point, the United States had tolerated the abuse of human rights by our allied governments in Central and South America, and Carter is going to start saying, no, we can't do that anymore. In fact, as an example, he is going to cut U.S. foreign aid to the government of Nicaragua because that government was guilty of grievous human rights abuses during the 1970s and refused to reform. Carter is also going to be involved in the return of the Panama Canal Zone to the country of Panama. And we signed the Panama Canal Treaty in 1977 is when it was signed. 78 is when the Senate ratified it. But that treaty said that the United States would turn control of the canal back over to Panama no later than 1999. And so this is part of the 1970s anti-imperialism movement that kind of swept across not only the United States but also the world. Probably the biggest thing that happened while Carter was president, but the biggest positive, was something called the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords, that took place in 1979, and President Carter invited the leaders of Egypt and Israel to come to Camp David, the presidential retreat, and to begin the process of negotiating peace between these two historic enemies. These two countries had been at war since 1948, when Israel was created. The day Israel announced their independence, that they were an independent country, Egypt and others declared war on Israel. And Carter brought them to Camp David to try to help them negotiate peace. And they ended up signing the Camp David Accords, where Egypt became the first Middle Eastern country to make peace with Israel. And so in this treaty, a couple of the big things. One, Israel agreed to return something called the Sinai Peninsula. In the 6-Day War, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula. You can look on the big map here. Here's Israel. Here's the territory they took from Egypt. They're going to give that back. Now, in exchange for returning the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt is going to recognize Israel's right to exist, which is very nice if you are a country to have everyone else agree that you have the right to exist and be an equal partner in the world. Now, other things that involve Carter's administration aren't so great, and we do remember these. These are also key moments in the Cold War. Involving the Soviet Union, a couple of things. The first was something called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Part 2. This nuclear treaty would have continued to reduce the number of nuclear weapons that the United States and the Soviet Union had. Carter felt this was a big deal, and he had sent people to negotiate this. However, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the treaty. There was a lot of opposition to this treaty in the Senate, and among people that were more conservative than Carter, because the Soviet Union had not lived up to its end of previous nuclear reduction treaties. And so there was a sense in the Senate of, why should we ratify this when we reduce our weapons and they don't? And so this was not ratified. Also involving the Soviet Union, something involving the country of Afghanistan. You probably know where Afghanistan is, or at least you've heard it. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. It was right on the border of the Soviet Union. And so there was a lot of refugees that were created because of this, because people were trying to get away from the Soviet Union and Soviet control. President Carter responded by announcing the United States would boycott the 1980 Summer Olympics that were going to be held in Moscow. This was, in many people's mind, a non-response. Afghanistan actually was an ally of the United States. The government was an ally of the United States. And we responded with, we're not going to go play games with you. Now, what a lot of people don't know is that Carter did authorize the CIA to begin working with a group in Afghanistan called the Mujahideen. The Mujahideen were, many of them were Afghan freedom fighters, but they were also freedom fighters who came from other parts of the world, specifically Muslim countries. Afghanistan was a Muslim country that had been invaded by the Soviet Union. And so Muslims from around the world came to help fight against the Soviet Union. And so Carter had the CIA begin to work with the Mujahideen to help train them in things like guerrilla warfare and how to strike back against the Soviet Union, how to maintain a guerrilla campaign against them, which they would continue into the mid-1980s before the Soviet Union finally withdrew. The other thing, Carter announced something we kind of call the Carter Doctrine, where he threatened the Soviet Union. He said that the United States would use military force to stop the Soviet Union if the Soviet Union made any more moves toward the Middle East. So he'll give up Afghanistan, but he's not going to let the Soviet Union invade anything else, because next to Afghanistan is the country of Iran. And Iran is part of the Middle East. And essentially what Carter said when he said that was, the United States was willing to go to war to protect oil. He's the first president really to do that. Now, why was there a fear that the Soviet Union was going to invade the Middle East? Because of our last thing here, the country of Iran. Earlier in 1979, there was a revolution in Iran, and the Shah, the emperor, was overthrown. The emperor was an ally of the United States, and after he was overthrown, he fled, and eventually he made his way to the United States because he discovered he had cancer, and so he came to the United States for cancer treatment. Well, a new government was formed, but the new government didn't necessarily have control of the people because of something that happened called the Islamic Revolution. Iran was a fairly Western country prior to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, when a man named Ayatollah Khomeini said that Muslims, Iranians in particular, were becoming too influenced by the evils of the West, specifically the great Satan that was the United States. And in 1979, because the United States was harboring the Shah and allowing him to stay here for cancer treatment, those that had been victims of his dictatorship protested the fact that the U.S. had him and the fact that the U.S. had backed him, and they wanted him returned. And in November of 1979, college-age student protesters stormed the U.S. Embassy and took 50 Americans at the embassy hostage. And they would hold them hostage from November of 1979 until January of 1981. There was a rescue attempt planned by the military. Logistical failures and technical failures forced the cancellation of the rescue mission. Unfortunately, some of those errors caused equipment failures, and several Americans died in the aborted rescue attempt. But what most people saw was the hostages being held over and over and over again for 444 days. A news program was created on ABC that aired every night, talking about what happened today in the hostage crisis. You might have heard of this program now. It's still on. Now it is called Nightline, but it got its start during the Iran hostage crisis. And the problem with the Iran hostage crisis is Carter and his administration just look terrible in this. Part of it has to do with they don't know who to negotiate with. There is a government in Iran, but the protesters were not part of the government. And the protesters would not listen to their government. When their government would say, we want to release the hostages, the protesters wouldn't. The protesters listened to the Ayatollah Khomeini. And the Ayatollah Khomeini wouldn't listen to the Iranian government. And so Carter's administration looked weak and ineffectual, and the big problem with this is the protesters are taken in November of 79, and they're held all through the year 1980, which is also an election year. And so Carter is going to have this monkey on his back as he fights for re-election. We have now ended the 1970s. We are on our way through history. It'll be done before you know it. Thanks again for watching.